Fantasy football literally takes over the entire world this time of year. Everywhere you look, it's sleepers, busts, breakouts, perfect draft strategy. People in your office, people at class, your friends are coming out of the woodwork to ask you about your draft, your team, their team, when you don't even remember them paying attention to football for 1 second in their entire lives. And the funny thing is, while all of this time and money is invested in fantasy football and all this focus is on it this time of year, it's objectively a completely chaotic and random game where so much of what happens is just not in your control. No matter how much you prepare, no matter how many breakouts you draft, no matter how many sleepers you know about. And honestly, it just never will be. Which is fun, and is totally okay, don't get me wrong. It's fun to play a game like this where the skill level is kind of all evened out because you really can't control any outcomes. But we'd be foolish to think that the winner in most of these leagues is the person who makes the most correct decisions or was objectively the best over the course of an entire season, which makes fantasy football completely inferior to its baseball counterpart, who's its dad at the end of the day, the original fantasy sport, which takes so much more skill and acumen to actually win that meticulous grind of an elusive fantasy baseball crown compared to fantasy football. And let me explain why. The main reason that fantasy football invites so much chaos and randomness is just simply because of the format. At the end of the day, we're just working in very small sample sizes in literally every aspect of the game. So with that, there's much less that you can control as the player. You're only starting a handful of positions, a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 or 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and a flex. That's what, 7 or 8 total players? Then you're also dealing with only 12 or 13 individual matchups before you get to the playoffs in your leagues. And then those playoffs themselves become a complete crapshoot of just individual weeks with 2 teams pitted against each other. So again, anything can go wrong. How many times do you hear someone, or maybe this happened to you guys, say that they got screwed in their league? They had the most points, they didn't even make the playoffs. They had the second most points and they lost their playoff matchup because the team they played had the most points. It happens every single year in fantasy football and will forever. And I'm going to get into specifics of why. Fantasy football gets to the point every single season where the margins are so thin and all the results are so random that one player routinely will swing entire leagues. Like last season, when Lions running back Jahmyr Gibbs was on 29% of all championship rosters in ESPN fantasy football. 29%. Nearly 3 out of 10 champions had Jahmyr Gibbs on their teams. The next closest to him was Jamar Chase on 21% of teams. Gibbs himself was on nearly twice as many championship winners than Saquon Barkley, who only found himself on 15% of all championship rosters. That was fewer than 3 different team defenses. So Saquon Barkley, who was objectively the best player in the NFL last year, the AP Offensive Player in the Year, 2,000-yard rusher, found himself on fewer championship rosters than 3 different defenses, when at the same time, over the course of the entire season, Gibbs and Barkley practically scored the exact same amount of PPR points. And Barkley had more points than Gibbs in half PPR and no PPR formats, which is crazy to think about, but it's all because of the shapes of their seasons, where Barkley was much more consistent throughout, tailed off a bit at the end of the year when the Eagles had everything locked up, where Jahmyr Gibbs went completely ballistic the last 3 weeks of the season. But the funniest part about this, possibly the most frustrating if you yourself lost a championship to a Jahmyr Gibbs team, is that the only reason he became this lightning rod and this league winner in most formats is because his teammate and player he shared the backfield with in Detroit, David Montgomery, sprained his MCL towards the end of the season. That turned Gibbs into the absolute every down running back in the Lions, where he went from a player that averaged 13 carries, 75 yards, 3 catches, 28 receiving yards, and about 1 touchdown per game before Montgomery went down, which made him a great player. That was like 20 fantasy points a game. That's a smash hit for a player that was mostly drafted across the second round in drafts last year. But then in 3 games following that Montgomery injury, Gibbs averaged 21 carries, 122 yards, 4 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns per game in what were the fantasy playoffs. That's over 30 points per week. If Montgomery never sprains his MCL last year, almost every single fantasy league looks different. And there was no real way to prepare for that or expect it to be coming. No way that you ever could have actually planned for the fact that a running back in a timeshare with a really explosive player would get hurt and miss the fantasy playoffs. The only way to have reaped those rewards were literally to get lucky and spend a second-round pick on Jahmyr Gibbs last August. Similarly, Michael Carter on the Cardinals, just an obscure backup running back for his entire career, finds himself in a situation in Arizona where James Conner and Trey Benson both get injured. So then Carter, who was rostered in fewer than 2% of ESPN leagues on New Year's Day, gets 36 touches over the final 2 weeks of the season, which were oftentimes the semifinals and finals in most fantasy football leagues, and wound up on 13% of championship rosters on ESPN, which was more championship rosters than Bills running back James Cook, who led the NFL in rushing touchdowns. Then you'll have the total flip side of this. Call this the anti-Jahmyr Gibbs, the anti-Michael Carter, where a few poorly timed bad weeks for superstar players could totally have tanked your season. Like Josh Allen, who was the MVP of the NFL last season. A total Superman season from Allen, just completely incredible, where he was one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football, coming off back-to-back weeks of being the #1 overall QB, heading into the fantasy playoffs, and 8 of 9 weeks where he scored as one of the top 7 at his position. Then you get to week 16 in real life, the fantasy playoffs, and Josh Allen has a home game against the Patriots where it's only 14 degrees and it feels like 0. He has a bad day, goes 16 for 29 with 1 touchdown, 1 pick, scores you 12 standard fantasy points, and you may have lost because of Josh Allen, who again, heading into the fantasy playoffs, was one of the best players in all fantasy football. If the Bills would have just built a dome 50 years ago instead of having an outdoor stadium in Buffalo, you probably would have won your league. And that's it right there. Anything can happen in these leagues that can just tank you, even though you're doing everything right, which is incredibly frustrating after, again, all of the time that you will put in to managing, manicuring, perfecting your roster, making trades, great draft strategy. All of it goes down the tubes for something that had nothing to do with you. Whereas in baseball, the rosters are so deep. We're fielding full teams, infielders, outfielders, catcher, utility players, sometimes up to 9 pitchers in most leagues. And we're playing 22, 23 weeks of regular season ball. Then you have rotisserie leagues, which just count every single stat that's accumulated the entire season. There's so much more that happens, so many more stats to accumulate, where so much more of the time, the cream rises to the top, and the team who deserves to win winds up actually winning. It's so impossible to have a similar lightning rod like Jahmyr Gibbs from last year's fantasy football season ever in a fantasy baseball season. Like right now, this baseball season, Cal Raleigh is having one of the most important fantasy baseball seasons ever, where as a catcher, he has 50 homers, 110 RBIs, and 15 stolen bases, still with a month to play in the season. That's about 2 times more valuable than the next closest catcher to him in standard 5x5 leagues. But then if we take a look at his roster rate among the best teams in the main event on the NFC, which are the highest stakes, most competitive fantasy baseball leagues on earth, Raleigh is only rostered among 2 of the top 10 teams in that contest and 5 of the top 20 teams. There's just never going to be a player who can swing a fantasy baseball season kind of out of nowhere like the average fantasy football season. Then we get to some other really annoying parts about fantasy football. I can't wait to nitpick here. Basically, your entire league will be determined by the draft pick that you get. We have years and years of data telling us that the top 3 or 4 picks in a fantasy football draft have a much, much higher chance of winning a championship than the people who draft towards the back end. And I know that doesn't sound right because snake drafts seem objectively fair. You go back and forth every single round. But I have these great tables here from an article on the Fantasy Index from a bunch of years ago, don't get me wrong, but it just shows the difference in total points every single year from teams that draft among the top compared to teams at the back. It's stark. It's gotten so stark over the last few years that now the norm in a lot more high-stakes fantasy football leagues, especially on the NFFC and on Sleeper, the best fantasy sports app ever, shout out Sleeper, that they do something now called a 3rd round reversal, where the team who gets the first overall pick picks the top of the 1st round, it goes to the 2nd round, that team who picked first overall gets the last pick of the 3rd round, but then the team who was the last spot in the draft gets the first pick of the 3rd round. The 3rd round reverses itself. So after you make the last pick of the 2nd round, you do not get the first pick of the 3rd round. The team at the back end gets that. Again, 3rd round reversal. And then we have a very normal snake draft from that point on. That's a way that we've been able to level the field in fantasy football because it's so clear that the teams at the top have a massive advantage. And again, this has been proved because those highest stakes leagues have a 3rd round reversal almost entirely at this point. That's a huge adjustment that was made to make fantasy football more fair for, again, something that's totally out of the player's control. But then also, super annoyingly, sometimes you can actually get that top pick and still get totally screwed by injuries because they hold so much more weight in fantasy football when, again, you're just starting fewer players. Like, take last season. You get the first overall pick. You are so excited. You have the opportunity to take Christian McCaffrey, who the year before was by far the best player in fantasy football. 2,000 yards from scrimmage, 20 touchdowns, a key component of what looked like it was going to be one of the best offenses in the entire league. Then all of a sudden, right before the first game of the season on Monday Night Football, you hear about this phantom Achilles injury that was totally underreported.
He's not going to be active. Came out, did not feel right with the calf, the Achilles. It's been an issue. He was limited in practice last week. The 49ers listed him as questionable. They thought he was going to be able to play. He expressed confidence that he was going to be able to play. People thought it would be a full workload for Christian McCaffrey, but today it just didn't feel right.
and boom, Christian McCaffrey gets knocked out for most of the season. Then he comes back a few months later, plays a handful of games, and boom, gets injured again. A completely lost season for McCaffrey, who everybody spent a first overall pick on because we didn't even know an injury existed for him. Like, there's just absolutely nothing you can do about that. And again, something like this happens similarly in fantasy baseball because you could take a pitcher early, pitchers get injured all the time, then bam, you lose that pitcher. But there is so much more depth on a roster and length of a season to make up that time that just simply doesn't exist in fantasy football, especially with a guy at the top. 97% of teams on ESPN that drafted Christian McCaffrey last year did not win their championship. There's just no way to recover from a first overall pick getting injured in the silence of the night that you had no idea about pre-draft. But probably even more annoying than the literal player that you have getting injured, losing that production, is when a player that you don't have gets injured and it kills the production for someone you have. Like, think about 2 seasons ago when Joe Burrow catches a mystery injury that's underreported during a Week 10 game against the Ravens. It stinks to lose Burrow, I get that, but if anybody had Ja'Marr Chase on your team, you went from having one of the best players in fantasy football to someone who was borderline unplayable just because they lost their quarterback, not even losing them themselves. Chase that season was averaging 8 catches, 91 yards, and nearly a touchdown per game with Burrow. But after Burrow went out, Chase averaged 5 catches, 64 yards, and had 1 total touchdown in the 6 games he played with backup quarterback Jake Browning. That's something you have absolutely no control over, nothing you can prepare for, nothing you can react to, and just destroyed your season in one shot. There's really no comparison for that at all in fantasy baseball. There's no other player that's going to affect the production of another player to the point where it makes said player totally unrosterable. And that was someone who you used a top draft pick on, and everything was working out great. He was one of the best players in the league, and then bam, gone in 1 second. Similarly, another part of fantasy football that has just no comp in baseball, the fact that there's game scripts and garbage time heroes who can be objectively bad players and just kind of take over leagues because of bad situations and nonsense production that's not even well reflected in on-field results in the actual games being played. Like Jonnu Smith, tight end of the Dolphins last season. He had never had more than 70 targets, 50 catches, or 580 yards in an NFL season. He goes to the Dolphins, and he's going there to compete with Durham Smythe to be their starting tight end. He's ranked outside of the top 20 tight ends in fantasy by all the major rankings and consensus experts. Then, out of nowhere, he just becomes this check down, garbage time king for a Dolphins team that was flailing in the wind for most of the season. He winds up with 111 targets, 88 receptions, which were both 4th most among all tight ends, only behind Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, and Travis Kelce. The absolute golden tier of tight ends in football. Then you got Jonnu Smith right there, garbage time legend. He becomes one of the most valuable waiver claims in the entire fantasy football season, all because of how bad his team was. That's so dumb. And then my favorite garbage time hero of all time, the BOAT. Blake Bortles, 2015. Bortles put up a season with 4,400 passing yards, 35 touchdowns, and was the number 4 overall QB in fantasy. When at the same time, he led the NFL with 18 interceptions and was sacked 51 times. We know from everything that happened that Blake Bortles was not a very good quarterback, and just thinking about that wasn't even that good of a season. But he's QB4 in fantasy, which underscores another huge problem in fantasy football, where quarterback play is completely misrepresented. This is the most important position in all of sports, and it's just effectively nerfed in most leagues. Rushing QBs get so much more of a bump, and they're so overpowered just because of the way scoring systems work. Like heading into this season, Jalen Hurts is being drafted ahead of Joe Burrow. Justin Fields is being drafted ahead of Justin Herbert. That does not reflect the value of these guys in real life. And even just playing in 1 quarterback leagues and 10 or 12 team leagues, these guys always get dropped down to the back of the draft. It's very commonplace to wait on quarterbacks, where again, in real life, this is the most important position in all of sports. I remember a great Peter King quote from back in the day about why he didn't play fantasy football. Shows you about the kind of kid I was, reading 30 pages of Monday Morning Quarterback when I was like 11 years old. But he said he would never play fantasy football because he could not accept anything that was based on football where Ray Rice was more valuable than Peyton Manning. And that's the truth, Peter. That's why I do love the fact that more fantasy football leagues this day and age are moving towards super flex systems, which allows people to use a quarterback as a flex player. That's amazing. That means everyone in your league is rostering 2 quarterbacks. Quarterbacks get drafted near the top of the draft. That is much more reflective on how valuable these players are in real life. And a great adjustment that's making fantasy football much more creative and adding strategy to a game that's really, again, very repetitive and very random that you really have no control over. Baseball has a similar problem with this in rotisserie categories-based leagues where closers and stolen base threats get really, really overrated when in real life, they're not that important. Like you have high-stakes leagues where this season Devin Williams was drafted ahead of Jacob deGrom. that's in no way reflective of real baseball. And this is a great response again by fantasy football to move towards super flex formats. You're adding these wrinkles to drafters' minds and this extra thought that is truthfully the backbone of fantasy baseball and why fantasy baseball is so great. There's so many more positions and player types to manage as you go down a board, weighing the options between catchers, pitchers, outfielders. That's the beauty of the game. The way that every single draft is different, kind of like a snowflake, where in fantasy football, everyone is completely robotic, going through the motions, kind of doing the exact same thing as everybody else. So if any of you fantasy football bros want to try a real game that takes real skill, genuine knowledge, and tons of creativity, come around for fantasy baseball season next March. We'll teach you a thing or two. Thank you guys again for watching this video. This is a very different thing than I usually do on this channel. We'll be back to regular fantasy baseball stuff after this. Got pitcher rankings coming out, probably do some more waiver wire stuff, get you guys ready for your playoffs. But I had to spend some time just talking about the honest truth about fantasy football. So thank you guys again. I'll see you next time.